Welcome to Your Family's Health, the program that focuses on healthcare issues with unique and different modalities for taking charge of your health today. Experts talk weekly with our continuing roster of guests from around the country and right here in Nassau County to keep you up to date on the latest health issues and trends. Take care of your mind, body, and soul. Spend the next half hour with the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC, and get on the journey to better health.
Hello and welcome to Your Family's Health. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the nursing department here at Nassau Community College. And today we're going to meet a top transplant physician who rode the emotional roller coaster of saving and losing lives until it was time to step back and assess his own life. Our guest today is Dr. David Weil, the former director of the Center for Advanced Lung Disease and Lung Transplant Program at Stanford. He is currently the principal of Weill Consulting Group, which focuses on improving the delivery of transplant care. And he is the author of a new book called Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant. Dr. Weil, welcome to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So it's nice to have you. And tell us a little bit about your background and what made you become a physician that specializes in organ transplants.
Well, I'm the son of a doctor and a nurse, and so I have a medical background from way back. And when I went to medical school, I didn't really have a specialty in mind, but as time went on, I got more and more attracted to lungs. And my father was a lung doctor, so that might have had something to do with it. But really, the transplant bug bit me when I was an intern. And I write about a story in the book where I was called into duty on the kidney transplant service just as an intern. And we did a transplant that first night, and I couldn't believe it. You know, you can change somebody's life with an operation just in an instant. And so from that moment on, I was hooked, even though I eventually did lung transplant rather than kidney transplant.
So you only transplant lungs, or do you transplant other organs?
Just lungs.
Just lungs.
Just lungs.
How many lung transplants have you done?
I think over 1,000 now.
Okay.
During the course of my career, I've been at it for about 25 years in total, and so I think over 1,000.
So how do you get the lungs?
So the lungs are generally from brain-dead donors out there. So these are folks that have consented, a family member that's consented for organ donation. So right now in America, I would say 99% come from what we call cadaveric brain-dead donors. So I always take this opportunity to encourage folks to tell their loved ones that they'd like to become an organ donor, in addition to telling the Department of Motor Vehicles when you get your driver's license.
That's fascinating. So when the individual becomes brain dead and has desired or has verbalized a desire to become a transplant, what would you call that, donor?
Yes.
That is the biggest or the greatest gift of life, would you say?
It is. You know, I don't know if your listeners know this or not, but one organ donor, one person that agrees to be an organ donor can save 8 lives. And even though their family, obviously in the midst of a terrible tragedy, can find a silver lining, I think, by agreeing to be an organ donor. And then, as I've experienced many times in my life, go on to have meaningful relationships with the folks that they actually had a part in saving the life of.
How shortly after the patient is considered brain dead do you have to harvest that organ for it to be viable for a transplant?
We have not long is the bottom line. We have about 4 to 6 hours to get the organs really out of a patient and into another patient. We've been able to develop over the last several years a technology that's called DCD, or donation after cardiac death, where a patient can actually be dead for a short period of time without any blood circulation or or lung ventilation, and we can harvest those organs as well and use those. But that's less commonly done than the way I described earlier.
So once you hear that a patient is brain dead, how are those organs? Is it flown to you, or is it go to a particular site?
Yeah, unfortunately, right now, every transplant program is responsible for going to the donor hospital, and that creates quite a logistical challenge, as you might imagine, for a transplant team, which generally speaking, these teams are not very big. Not a lot of people working on the transplant team. So they're responsible 24/7, 365 to be available to fly out, usually, sometimes car ride, but usually flying out to a remote donor hospital, procuring the organs, and then flying back. And so this happens in the middle of the night more often than not. And so for the transplant team, it's quite a taxing process. Sure. And I would like to see, and I'm helping a few different entities, see that script be flipped a little bit, where the transplant team stays at its own hospital and the organs come to them.
So what would you say to individuals who say, I'm not going to check that box on the back of my driver's license because I think that if I ever were to have a cardiac arrest, they would kind of not treat the cardiac arrest because now I am more of a candidate to be a donor?
Yeah, you bring up an important point. Yeah, you bring up this is a really important point. So throughout our time in organ transplant, there's been a lot of what I would call misconceptions about the organ donation process. You touched on a big one, and that big one is, gee, they won't save my life because they want my organs for somebody else. Yeah. But there's also cultural, religious, ethnic reasons that some parts of our community donate more often than others. It's really an education issue about educating people, and it's all a matter of trust at the end of the day. In other words, the family that is considering donation has to trust the process, quote unquote, is being fair to them, and that, in fact, we would try to save the life if we could, but we can't. So then we're asking for organ donation. So I think, like a lot of things in healthcare, it boils down to trust. And let's be frank, there's a lot of mistrust out there in the healthcare world.
What makes someone
some of it justified, by the way.
Yeah,
so
yes.
I'd like to add that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know. What makes someone a good candidate to be an organ donor or to receive a transplant?
There's various criteria for, depending on which organ you're talking about, but by and large, we're looking for younger people to donate, usually age 65 and below, but sometimes even older than that. The same is true for the recipients. We're looking for people that are younger, 70, 75 is the upper cutoff for most organs, and who don't have a host of other medical problems other than the organ failure that they're experiencing that requires them getting a transplant in the first place. So the best transplant candidates are people that, if it weren't for that one organ damage, one end organ failure, if they didn't have that, they would actually be fairly healthy. Those are the best recipients. So
tell me how the pandemic has affected you, either procuring the organ or people interested in becoming a donor. Yeah, it's a good question. The pandemic's actually affected organ transplantation in a number of ways. So when all of this hit in the spring of 2020, transplant activity ground to a halt, mostly. And it started to come back in the summer of 2020, and now is actually above even levels that we had seen pre-pandemic, with over 40,000 solid organ transplants done in the country each year. So on that end, we're doing pretty well. But what I would say is that there are going to be people that were afflicted with COVID-19 in severe cases that are going to require a lung transplant in order to survive. And we've already, in our country, done a few hundred lung transplants for people with COVID pneumonia that really had no other opportunity to get well and leave the hospital except for a transplant. I'm very interested to hear about the real stories and the real people that inspired you to write your book. Can you share a story with us?
Sure. There's a few that stick out to me. out of the hundreds that I could have written about. But there was, there's patients that didn't get a good shot. In other words, patients that were turned down at other transplant centers because, for instance, I write about one young man who was developmentally delayed, had some intellectual dysfunction, really, cognitive impairment. And he was considered, quote unquote, not smart enough to be able to take care of himself after the transplant. I decided to take a risk on him, and he did very well after the transplant. But it's one of those kinds of patients where the transplant team itself sometimes doesn't even agree. And, we discuss and sometimes argue amongst ourselves. And another young man that we transplanted was a 36-year-old gentleman who had 2 young kids, ex-college football player, who developed a rare kind of cancer that's not typically amenable to lung transplant that we again decided to take a risk on, and he also ended up doing well. But some of the stories I write about in the book are also ones that never got a shot at getting a transplant. In other words, they died on the waiting list. And those hit me very hard because I wanted everybody that we took care of to at least get to the starting line, to at least get a shot at getting a transplant. But as I write about, there's some patients that just don't make it. And that's why I'm so passionate about advocating for organ donation.
You're listening to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard. And today we're talking to Dr. Weil, the former director of the Center for Advanced Lung Disease and the Lung Transplant Program at Stanford. He's currently the principal of Weill Consulting Group, which focuses on improving the delivery of transplant care. And he is the author of a new book called Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant. So, Dr. Weil, how long is the list for transplant, the waiting list?
It varies by how busy an individual program is. If we do a lot of transplants, the waiting list gets smaller and smaller. But just to give your listeners an idea, there's over 107,000 people currently waiting for an organ transplant here in America, and 17 people die every day waiting for an organ transplant. So we have people that are waiting. We have more people that need a transplant than we have organs to give them. So some of our patients, maybe just to answer your question a little more directly, waited a day on the waiting list, and some 2 months, and some a year. And so I write about how difficult that waiting period is because you're essentially walking around on pins and needles waiting for that phone to go off, and me or somebody like me being on the other end of the line saying it's time.
So that brings me to the question of the people who are called, those that are the recipients of the organs. Does that depend upon any kind of socioeconomic advantage or disadvantage?
Yeah, my group at Stanford studied this. We studied not only socioeconomic advantages, and I think those exist. Access to health care would be a primary reason why they exist. But the other things that concerned us, and this has actually been proven true throughout the transplant process, whether or not it's referral to a transplant program, being able to get put on a waiting list, how long you waited on a waiting list, and how well you do after a transplant varies by race. And one of the things that we studied was in heart and lung transplant and found racial disparities throughout the process. Now, I think that your listeners are probably aware that racial disparities have been shown in nearly every facet of medicine.
That's right.
Transplant's no different, even though I would like to think it's different because it's a more egalitarian process. I always hoped it would be fairer than it was, but it's not. There's racial disparities throughout it. I also had experience in my own family of my father who received a liver transplant as well. And I write about this in the book, where he was 68 years old by the time he needed a liver transplant. And he was a physician and was, a white man of some means. And he got his transplant at a time when there wasn't people that age being transplanted. And I always wondered, did he have an advantage because I was a transplant doctor and he was a well-established, successful lung doctor himself. And so it's concerned me throughout my career that the system's really not fair and it's not a level playing field.
Thank you for the honesty there. Is there a committee who regulates who gets a transplant to decrease the disparities that exist with organ transplantation?
Yeah, there's really two different levels of that kind of activity that I think you're talking to. One is in the individual transplant program, where there's a selection meeting every week, and we actually call it a selection meeting, which is kind of ironic. It's an awesome responsibility, picking who's on the transplant list and who's not. And I write about these meetings in the room and bring the reader into the room with me, because I think patients would assume that it's all based on medical criteria that's very objective, but it's not. In some instances, because we are human beings making these decisions, we bring our own biases into the room, and we make our own value judgments based on our experience. Somebody like us, we relate to more. And as hard as we do to fight that, I think it still exists.
Yes.
Now, at a broader level, there's an organization called UNOS, who's United Network for Organ Sharing, that is very attuned to this issue and is trying to do the best it can to address some of these inequities. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to transplant programs making themselves aware of these biases and, elevating them from the subconscious or unconscious to the conscious, so that we can try to avoid that the best we can. So I think some progress is being made, but throughout most of my career, I think these biases did exist.
That's fascinating. So what happens when a transplant fails? Once you talked about the disparities in the failing of the transplant, how do you save the patient if the transplant fails? Is there a thing where is there a time limit there, or is there, a critical time that goes on with?
It's very difficult, and it also varies by organ. The one thing about kidney transplant that I always envied as not being a kidney transplant doctor is if their organ transplant fails, then the patient can always go back on dialysis, and that's nice. That's a nice safety net.
Yeah.
Liver transplant, heart transplant, lung transplant, you're usually stuck with trying to retransplant the patient. In other words, getting them back on the waiting list, trying to find an organ for them, and essentially redo the operation. That's very difficult to do. It's difficult surgically to do. It's complicated medically. It's got a lot of problems with it. And of course, those patients go back on the waiting list. And as I've talked about, we don't know when an organ's going to become available once you go on the waiting list. So when the transplants fail, it's devastating to the families and the patients, of course.
Is there a medication protocol post-transplant that patients have to stay on?
Yes, and it's complicated. We spend a good amount of time in the postoperative period managing those medications, but a transplant patient will be in the neighborhood of 15 medications every single day post-transplant. And so it's a complicated regimen. All the medicines have side effects. They suppress the immune system, making an individual more susceptible to infection. And in fact, we've seen some of our transplant recipients get COVID-19 after transplant because they're immunosuppressed, and they've got about a 1 in 4 chance of dying if they contract the coronavirus, which is obviously much, much higher than if you or I got it.
So are you recommending an extra COVID booster for patients who are transplant recipients?
I am. I actually wrote a Washington Post piece a few months ago where I advocated strongly for not listing a patient for a transplant unless they received the vaccine. And obviously, as everything with COVID-19, it's a political hot issue. And there was general agreement that should be the case. But there's obviously some people that think that mandating vaccines is too heavy-handed and too much control and things of that nature. The point I've tried to make is I'm not making a value judgment about an individual wanting or not wanting the vaccine. What I do want is to make a medical judgment that patients will do a lot better after transplant if they get vaccinated before they're transplanted. And that's just a straight medical judgment. That has nothing to do with politics or value judgments or anything of the kind.
And that includes the vaccine and the booster, certainly.
It does. It does.
So it's very important that with this transplantation that economically it's affordable. Does insurance cover a transplant?
It does, and it covers it to varying degrees. I think a lot of people maybe see that the big cost is the transplant operation itself, and it is a big cost. But there's costs that go on for the rest of the patient's lives, paying for medications, transportation to and from the hospital. A lot of the patients that we transplant sometimes are hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from the transplant center, and insurance by and large does not cover their return to the transplant center. So they're having to come out of pocket for that. So there's all kinds of hidden costs within transplant that we want covered because it's really part of the care, just like the operation is part of the care. You're also probably aware that different insurance plans have different copays for the medications. The transplant medications are expensive. And so there's often difficulty among families to get those medications paid for.
Yeah. So give me a range of price for the actual surgery for a transplant.
Yeah, the way transplant is contracted is for the first year of care. So in other words, we make a deal, if you will, with the insurance companies. If you send the patient to get transplanted here, and most of the time this was at Stanford for me, then it's going to cost X. And X generally was $800,000, $900,000, $1 million a year, 800,000, $900,000 or $1 million a year for that first year of care. Wow. So this is expensive.
Yes.
This is expensive.
Yes. Yeah. So what is the quality of life that one can expect after a transplant?
You know, it's really good, and I think it's even better than a lot of patients expected. 85% go back to doing pretty much any activity that they wanted to do, and patients have told me the things that they want to do: hike, bike, play golf, chase grandkids, go back to work. They're really able to do all of that, keeping in mind that they have to take their medications and come see us a little bit more frequently than they probably want to see a doctor. But the vast majority of them really get back to doing whatever it is they want to do.
That's great.
We have a lot of patients enter the transplant games, which is like the Olympic Games for transplants. Nice. And I'm always surprised at how much physical activity these patients can do, especially after getting such a big operation.
That's great. Any miracle stories like, marathon runners after a transplant?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the young man that I told you about that had cognitive issues that we transplanted, he had never run in his life. He had gotten to be age 19 and actually had never run, didn't physically know how to run, and he couldn't breathe, so he didn't have to know how to run. So he and I ran a 5K race after he was transplanted, and I'm not going to tell you who won. Oh. He was a lot younger than I was at the time.
I take it that he won.
He did. But we've had other patients, become bodybuilders and develop all this muscle mass, and we've had patients climb Kilimanjaro in Africa and do all sorts of things that are physically pretty tough to do for anybody.
So what prompted you to write the book? I know this is a great book. I see the book. It's beautifully. I love the colors, the cover, and everything. What prompted you to go ahead and write it?
When I was leaving Stanford, I had a lot on my mind. I had a lot on my mind about, what just happened? It was a 25-year career that a lot happened. And a lot of days I walked around the hospital by myself, wishing somebody was there to catch it all with me, because, we saw ethical issues, we saw medical miracles, we saw disappointment, we saw the whole range of human emotions. And what I wanted people to do is be in the room with me. And so when I sat down to write the book, I had taken notes throughout my entire career. I had a big binder full of them. And I started creating the scenes that I thought were the most important. And I did not set out to teach people about transplant. I don't think people want to be taught about transplant. I find it interesting, but I'm not sure the rest of the world would. What I wanted them to do is get a feel for what doing this kind of work really feels like. What's the emotion of it? And I talk about not only my patients' emotions and their families, but I also talk about my emotions doing it, because it had a profound effect on me and still does. And so that's really why I wanted to write the book.
Yeah, I think everybody should read it. How do I locate that book? Your listeners?
It's really pretty much everywhere you buy books. I have a website, davidweilmd.com, that
Spell
has
that
links
for me.
to really all. DAVIDWEILL.
Okay.
MD.com.
Okay.
And so on the site, you can basically click to your favorite bookseller and it'll show up there. I'm a supporter of independent bookstores, so I encourage your listeners to frequent those. But you can really find it anywhere you buy books.
What a rewarding profession you have, and just to have so much ability to give life. So I'm sure those stories impact your life in so many ways. What would I would say one thing that you want to leave us with?
I think the main thing, and I write about this in the book, is for all of us in the healthcare industry and beyond, those of us that are doing our job every day, is to make sure that we slow down a little bit and take care of ourselves, and also process the emotions that are going on with us as we go through our life. I did not do a particularly good job of that during the course of much of my career, but I think one thing I've learned doing this kind of work and then having the ability to write about it was, let's slow it down a little bit. Our life, I think, in our world encourages us to go faster and faster. Yeah. But I think the real emotion, the real benefit, the real joy comes from slowing it down.
Well, thank you for being here, Dr. David Weil, the former director of Center for Advanced Lung Disease and the Lung Transplant Program at Stanford. And he is the author of a new book called Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, I did too. This is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the nursing department here at Nassau Community College, and we want to thank you for listening to this week's edition of Your Family's Health.
We'd like to get your feedback on your family's health. Send your comments by emailing them to whpc@ncc.edu. Podcasts of today's show are available on iTunes, Android Podcasts, and Spreaker. This program was produced at the studios of Nassau Community College in cooperation with the nursing department. Join us next week for another edition of Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.